Picture this. It's 399 BCE, and we're standing right in the middle of ancient Athens. Today, we're diving into this explainer to unpack the wild life, the incredibly controversial death, and the honestly mind-blowing modern legacy of history's most famous philosopher, Socrates. It's pretty wild to think that a guy who literally never wrote a single word down somehow managed to build the entire foundation of Western thought. And, as we're going to see a bit later, he even laid the groundwork for modern psychology.
So we're kicking things off right at the climax with a massive historical paradox. How on earth did a free, democratic society end up forcing a 70-year-old intellectual to willingly drink a cup of poisoned hemlock? I mean, Athens was a city that absolutely prided itself on free speech. Yet, they took their most famous thinker and put him on trial for his life. To really unravel this mystery, we've got to look at who Socrates actually was, who he was up against, and the totally chaotic political climate of his time.
To understand why he was seen as such a huge threat, we've got to contrast his radical approach with the other big educators of the day, the Sophists. Now, the Sophists were these nomadic teachers who traveled all over the place, and they charged some pretty hefty fees. They basically taught rhetoric as a weapon, a way to just win debates and score political points, arguing that truth was completely relative to whoever was speaking at the time. Socrates, he was the exact opposite. He stayed put in Athens, he absolutely refused to take a single dime, and he was on this relentless, obsessive quest for absolute truth. He didn't just want to win an argument, he wanted to figure out the very core of human virtue.
And he went about this using a really unique approach called the maieutic method. Etymologically speaking, that translates to the art of midwifery. Actually, Socrates' own mother was a midwife, and he adopted this as the perfect metaphor for his entire philosophy. See, he didn't view himself as some grand teacher just dumping facts into an empty brain. Instead, he acted as a midwife of thought. By constantly asking these persistent, probing questions, he'd lead his fellow citizens into this state of, productive puzzlement, helping them essentially give birth to the ideas and knowledge that were already buried deep inside them.
But okay, to understand why this seemingly harmless midwife of thought ended up being executed, we really have to look at the severe trauma Athens had just gone through. Back in the 450s, during the golden age of Pericles, Athens was absolutely thriving. But then came some massive military defeats. Democracy was violently overthrown in 411, and then it happened again in 404 BCE by this brutal oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants. So we're talking about a deeply traumatized, highly paranoid city. And against that chaotic backdrop, Socrates slowly morphed in the public's eye. He went from being this eccentric guy wandering around barefoot to a perceived enemy of the state. The crucial thing to grasp here is that Socrates was carrying some immense political baggage. For starters, he openly criticized democratic assemblies. He argued that letting totally uninformed masses rule was just absurd. He basically equated running a state to a specialized craft, like navigating a ship or practicing medicine, not just a popularity contest. But what really damned him were his associations. His former pupils included Alcibiades, who became a notorious traitor to Athens, and Critias, the bloodthirsty leader of those 30 tyrants we just mentioned. Plus, during the tyrant's reign, Socrates was actually ordered to arrest an innocent man named Leon of Salamis. Now, Socrates refused, which he later bragged about to prove he was a good citizen, but crucially, he just went home. He did absolutely nothing to warn Leon. So to a lot of traumatized Athenians, his anti-democratic philosophy felt like a deep betrayal. To them, he looked like the intellectual mastermind behind the city's darkest, most murderous days.
Now, because of a general amnesty, Socrates couldn't legally be charged for anything that went down during the reign of the tyrants. So his accusers, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, had to get creative. They brought these incredibly vague but ultimately fatal formal charges against him: impiety and corrupting the youth. By accusing him of rejecting the state gods and inventing new divinities, the prosecution essentially handed the jury a blank canvas. It gave the 500 members of that jury the perfect excuse to project all their post-war grievances, all their fears, and all their simmering anger right onto him.
Faced with these charges, in a situation where honestly most guys would parade out their crying wives and kids to beg for mercy, Socrates did the exact opposite. He gave an unapologetic, totally defiant defense. He didn't plead for his life at all. Instead, he boldly stood there and told the jury he was actually a hero. He called himself a gadfly sent by the divine, claiming that by annoying them with questions, he was literally saving their souls. He made his stance crystal clear, essentially saying, "Men of Athens, I honor and love you, but I'm going to obey God rather than you. And as long as I have breath, I will never stop practicing and teaching philosophy." He basically said, if you let me live, I'm just going to keep doing exactly what I'm doing. And despite that mind-boggling defiance, he came unbelievably close to just walking away. Out of that 500-man jury,
280 voted guilty, but 220 voted for acquittal. Just think about that. A swing of barely 30 votes would have completely changed world history. It really proves his death wasn't just some inevitable tragedy. It was a very deliberate choice by his fellow citizens. And when you look at how he acted, maybe a deliberate choice by Socrates himself. See, Athenian law was kind of unique. It required the guilty party to propose their own counterpenalty to whatever the prosecution demanded, which in this case was death. So Socrates actually had a golden opportunity to save his own life. He could have just suggested exile, right? Pack up, leave town, end of story. Instead, he treated the trial like a joke, acting like a picador just trying to enrage a bull. He had the absolute audacity to propose that his punishment should be free meals in the Prytaneum. That was a massive public honor, usually reserved for Olympic champions. When they finally forced him to offer a real penalty, he reluctantly threw out a relatively small fine of silver, which his friends offered to pay for him. Well, as you can imagine, the jury's reaction was swift, and it was brutal. His sheer arrogance rubbed them so far the wrong way that 80 men who had originally voted him completely innocent actually switched their votes during the penalty phase just to condemn him to death. So it ended up being 360 for death and 140 for the fine. He literally gave them no choice but to choose the pride of their community over his unyielding, stubborn integrity.
Following that sentence, he spent his final hours hanging out in a jail cell with his friends before willingly drinking a cup of poisoned hemlock. His final words, which were later recorded by his brilliant student Plato, went something like, "The hour of departure has arrived, and we go our ways, I to die and you to live, which is the better fate is known only to God." Those iconic words permanently cemented his legacy. He instantly became this secular saint, the ultimate martyr for free speech and intellectual inquiry. He chose to submit to his own community's highly flawed laws rather than sneak away and violate his core principles.
But guys, here is the ultimate twist of this whole explainer. The story doesn't actually end in that damp Athenian jail cell in 399 BCE. The Socratic method didn't die with him. In fact, it traveled across millennia and evolved into an absolute cornerstone of modern psychological healing. Specifically, we're talking about cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
Today, clinical psychologists use a concept that is rooted entirely in Socrates' old playbook called collaborative empiricism. This is a therapeutic attitude where the therapist and the patient aren't in some sort of strict hierarchy. Instead, they work shoulder to shoulder. The therapist actively puts their own preconceived notions aside to help the patient tap into their own inner wisdom. Sound familiar? It is literally the exact same concept as the ancient midwife of thought, drawing the truth out of someone rather than trying to force it in.
And this ancient mindset translates beautifully into a very structured, modern therapeutic process. In CBT, Socratic questioning basically unfolds in 4 stages. First, asking informational questions just to bring data into the person's awareness. Second, actively listening to discover the unexpected details. Third, summarizing all that new information. And finally, synthesizing it so the patient can actually apply it to whatever concern brought them to therapy in the first place. The goal here isn't to change a patient's mind by lecturing them or winning a debate. It's entirely about guiding their own personal self-discovery. To achieve this, therapists use some really highly specific, targeted types of Socratic questions. For example, you have translation questions that are designed to completely shift a person's perspective. They might ask, "Hey, what would your friends say about this situation?" Or you have synthesis questions to encourage out-of-the-box divergent thinking, like, "What advice would you give to a friend who is in this exact same spot?" This isn't just casual chatting. It's a deeply structured method designed to foster psychological flexibility and create massive, lasting shifts in how a person views their world and tackles their problems.
Socrates famously believed, right down to his bones, that the unexamined life is simply not worth living. So, we want to leave you with this final thought to really ponder today. If a 2,400-year-old method of questioning can literally heal our modern minds, what deeply held beliefs are you failing to examine right now? Thanks so much for exploring this with us, and as always, keep questioning.